Let's begin with a figment of the imagination. You are about to leave your family, your friends, your home, your comfort, your safety. You do not know when you will be returning home. You have no clue where you are being deported and stationed. You are being taken to a place where you know you will be hated. After you hugged your family and friends for what you may think is the last time, you are on your way. And let's make one more thing clear. You didn't enlist. You didn't join. You didn't hop on board. You were drafted. You were forced to serve. Serving the country was not the issue, rather being judged for serving the country. When you return home, there is no one there to clap for you. No one stands to wait for the hero's plane to arrive. No one cheers and celebrates the life you have returned with. No, you are alone, uncelebrated, hated, spat upon, betrayed. This begins our story of Vietnam heroes.
And I think when you ask me what was it like what did I think when I arrived in Vietnam? When I arrived in Vietnam, it was the same thing that if I'd arrived at Buffalo Airport and landed at Buffalo Airport or any airport in the United States. It looked the same, everything was the same, right? As long as I was on the base, all right, air crew were treated to all of that, and it wasn't much of a difference. Obviously, when you were flying, right, you had other things to worry about. Yeah. When the enlisted person, he got off a contracted airliner. American Airlines flew him over there, landed him in Tan Son Nhut. A military airplane picked him up, and 18 hours after he left San Francisco in the terminal, right, he was on a military airplane with chickens and goats and Vietnamese, and he was let off at some mud strip somewhere, right? And he got off and he had his uniform on and so on, which he never wore again, only the fatigue pants and a t-shirt, because it was hot and it was sweaty all the time. If it wasn't raining, right, you could take a shower and 5 minutes after the shower you were sweating. And that's what he did, all right? So my arrival in Vietnam was not that much out of character from what I knew. The guy who got drafted, however, had an altogether different experience in arriving in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. That night he went out on patrol, wandered around in the bushes, waiting to be ambushed, and he did that every night for 13 months and tried to sleep in the day.
We start with a Vietnam hero who would never admit himself to be one, Edward Carlsen. I'll be honest. When I first began this project, I was simply going to write some facts down regarding the Vietnam War and look at the effect it had on soldiers. But as I began to research and interview, I suddenly realized there was a much more specific story to tell. There was a suppressed message, one that most textbooks do not want you to read, one that most reporters do not want you to hear, one that most producers do not want you to see. There was a voice that needed to be used for those who did not have one. Arriving in Vietnam was no different from arriving in Buffalo. It looked the same, besides the heat. But for the soldier who was dropped off on some muddy road, forced to find his own way, it wasn't that luxurious and simple. Why is it that we would never hear of a story such as this one? Well, no one would ever ask. By the time these grunt work men got home, no one knew about these stories of hardship, because no one cared. However, the Courant would still include the Vietnam War to be one of the top 10 stories of the decade. The Vietnam War is significant and can be proven by the article rating the top 10 events of the decade. Vietnam is top 3 events of the decade on this list. This newspaper states that the Vietnam War ended with communist victory. Carlsen alludes to these kinds of statements. The fact that a newspaper would boldly pose a headline featuring a stab at Vietnam is very enlightening. It shows the general journalist response to this war. Many hated the veterans of the war because they focused on a capitalistic loss instead of focusing on the good, perhaps giving refuge to a colossal amount of Vietnamese refugees.
The other interesting thing is, don't leave this out. The United States has never fought a war, right, that they felt they've lost except Vietnam. But at every place the United States has ever sent troops, they're still there. They're still in Guantanamo Bay from 1898. They're in Serbia, they're in Germany, they're in Japan, they're in England, right? They're in Korea. The only place that they're not is Vietnam. If that's the war we lost, we still got troops over there protecting whatever we're protecting, all right? But we don't have them in Vietnam. And so that's really interesting. And it became a cause célèbre for the media. And they really gave no credit or empathy to the guy who slugged it out.
Retired Lieutenant Colonel Carlsen clearly explains that people may view the Vietnam War as a loss. However, it is the only location we no longer have men in. The validity of his point is proven in the logic that we no longer have men fighting in Vietnam, but so many are quick to judge the war.
The Constitution gives you the right to free speech. The soldier gives you the right to say it and execute it. That you can walk around and say whatever the hell you want to say, including Jane Fonda. And
This kind of speech against the whole concept of Vietnam was not uncommon. Consider the various articles and entries that have been written in this light of how soldiers had to cope with what was said about them. When we have bad days, we are able to find support and strengthen our families and friends. The Vietnam soldiers did not have this option. Worse than being across the ocean from their friends and families, most of the society back home was rooting against them. One article in particular powerfully states, "So you thought you had a bad day." We can all attest to having bad days, but the next time you are bemoaning your bad day, think about the really bad days. The bad days weren't made any better with voices like Jane Fonda verbally attacking the men serving this country. A few hundred yards from the location of the photograph, American POWs were being subjected to all manner of torture at the Hanoi Hilton. Jane Fonda was proven to be mingling with the enemy, and she was proud of it. When later asked if she regretted the trip and these photographs, she said absolutely not. Fonda called returning POWs hypocrites and liars, adding, "These were not men who had been tortured. These were not men who had been starved. These were not men who had been brainwashed." Pilots were saying it was the policy of the Vietnamese and that it was systematic. I believe that's a lie. What many do not realize is that besides being one of the great actresses of her time, Jane Fonda presented herself as an avid anti-Vietnam War voice. Her discouraging words and accusations towards American soldiers in Vietnam left them angry with her for decades to come. We can not only pinpoint Jane Fonda, but she was a very bold advocate against the Vietnam War in her time. There were certainly others, most Americans, who hated the war and those fighting in it. 16 years later, under enormous pressure after Ronald Reagan had restored the honorable social standing of military service, Fonda admitted to former American POWs and their families that she regretted the pain she caused them. Few accepted her apology. To grant the benefit of the doubt, Jane Fonda apologized to American veterans. She never had to before because no one cared. And to be honest, people agreed with her. Once Reagan had rebuilt the respect America needed to have for its military, it is simple to see what this apology was rooted in.
I would recommend you do this. Do you drive? I would drive down to the VA hospital, park in the lot, walk in the front door, right? This would look good on your report, by the way. Okay? Your dad is the only one I know that's better than me for getting the pizzazz wrapped into that, right? But you show you've got a lot of it in that play, I'll tell you this anyway. I'll be telling you. Go in there and just, by yourself, just walk through there and walk back into the bowels of the play. They're not gonna do anything to you. You don't have to go upstairs and so on. Just walk around and see what's there. And you see these guys with their ponytails. They were all on marijuana all their life. They're a sorry-looking bunch. I went in there and I was going to try to get hearing aids because fighter pilots can't hear after they're right. And I thought, Ed, you don't need this. These guys need attention. You don't need to get hearing aids. You go home and get your own hearing aids, right, and be done with it, right? You just look. I mean, they've got their old field jackets on. They've got their Vietnam veteran hats, and they look like the scruffs that turned them into it. But remember, they didn't have the education you did. They didn't go to VMI, right? They didn't have the intelligence and the genes that you do. Your DNA is 6 standard deviations of what they were. Remember, though, that's who got sucked in. Cannon fodder. Okay? Just walk through there and spend 15 minutes walking around and say, I get the picture. I don't have to live here. I understand what Mr. Carlsen was telling me. And that'll give you the flavor to really get into something about it. All right?
The VA is a current work under construction. It has many weak links and weak aspects. The conditions of these establishments seem almost unreal and unlikely, but the accusations have been proven true. For example, whistleblowers at the Edwin Hines Jr. VA Hospital outside Chicago came forward in April with reports of cockroach infestation in the clinic's kitchen. The cockroaches reportedly ended up in patients' food, causing some veterans to refuse their meals. Equipment in the kitchen was coated in grime, VA employees said, because no one at the hospital bothered to clean. Apparently, the infestation had persisted for years, but the complaints about the filthy conditions were swept under the rug. The VA had cockroaches in their kitchen. While we eat at 5-star restaurants, the men who served this country are eating cockroaches. How does this seem right? Right. It doesn't. Another criticism records thousands of veterans saw their VA benefits abruptly cut off when government officials accidentally registered them as dead when they were very much alive. Between 2011 to 2015, the VA was forced to restore benefits to 4,201 veterans who had received mistaken death notices that resulted in the severance of their VA payments. The VA declined to say what caused the mishaps, but has suggested that employee error or computer glitches could be to blame. In some instances, veterans were marked as deceased when an individual or family member with a similar name died. One affected veteran told the Washington Examiner last year that such a sudden loss of income could be devastating to a veteran who relied on his or her VA benefits to survive. Not only are the Vietnam veterans lacking honor and respect where it's due, but some are being mistakenly announced dead. Shouldn't a Vietnam veteran at least have the privilege of not being declared dead until he actually dies? We have that privilege. Another serious problem posed is a VA hotline established in 2007 to assist veterans contemplating suicide was found to be a near complete failure by the agency's Inspector General. The agency watchdog discovered veterans' calls had gone to voicemail or were placed on hold and passed from operator to operator without ever receiving help. VA employees tasked with running the hotline did not even know the voicemail system existed, so they never returned the calls of suicidal veterans who left a message. The VA set up a suicide hotline just for veterans. This alone displays the tragic epidemic of PTSD for soldiers of all different wars. The conditions some veterans are forced to live in could lead them to suicidal thoughts and actions. But couldn't the veterans not even being able to use the hotline actually increase the probability of suicide? Lastly, but certainly not least, in October 2015, the Office of Special Counsel released the findings of an investigation into charges that the VA hospital in Puerto Rico was potentially abusing elderly veterans. Investigators discovered that staff at the Puerto Rico VA facility had neglected elderly residents by failing to assist them with essential activities of daily living. These activities included bathing, going to the bathroom, eating and drinking. This neglect created significant and serious health issues for those residents. The report sparked outrage after the public learned elderly veterans had been left in their own filth and denied food and water at the hospital. Elderly veterans, most likely Vietnam veterans, were denied the basic care that an elderly patient needs. The elderly already do not have a strong voice in our society, but combining this with the fact that most Vietnam veterans do not have a voice either makes the retired soldiers of our military vegetables. Not only is this cruel treatment to the elderly citizens of our country, but it is cruel treatment to men who put their lives on the line for this country. This is exactly what veteran Edward Carlsen refers to when he explains that no one cared about these guys when they were away and when they came back. If America didn't care about them then, why would they care about them now? The United States had always had a reputation for providing for its allies. Even when times got tough, the United States did not turn back on its commitments and investments in foreign allies. Since 1958, the United States has supplied about $114 million worth of similar aid. The United States already had formed a pattern and reputation for helping other nations in need, $114 million to be exact, showing the United States to be very generous when it came to foreign affairs. You could estimate that $114 million back then would be nearly $114 trillion today. The Vietnam War proved no different. But what could we say about the United States in regards to the soldiers in Vietnam? What were the soldiers eating? It certainly wasn't food fit for a king. None of the soldiers expected to be treated like kings. They served beyond themselves.
These are tough things now, see, you got to remember, pilots are chosen people, right? But real milk and real potatoes were hard to find. They were all reconstituted, right? We didn't eat in the mess hall. We had an officer's mess, but we still had powdered milk and powdered eggs, right, and powdered potatoes, right? They were hard to come by, so that getting really good meals, you had to go spend a weekend in Thailand or in Taiwan or in Japan. And of course, the ground forces never really got to do that. So that kind of became the first thing you would miss. And a shower that would last any longer than 10 minutes when you were in country, right, was hard to come by. And I think that staying cool, right, was tough to do. And if as you think back to what to your question, right, those are the things you missed: air conditioning, right, and the food was fine, all right, even for the grunts, except when they were in the field, all right, because then you had K rations, right? We now have meals ready to eat, MREs, over in Afghanistan and Iraq. They use MREs. The K rations, this was in the 65 to 75 time period, right? They were the K rations that were left over from Korea 30 years before, all right? Mm-hmm. You can see how the Vietnam troops were really treated well. And you could tell because with each K ration, you got a small package of cigarettes. And it was always fun to see Lucky Strike had green bullseyes, and Philip Morris came in olive drab. I mean, they were packaged in the 40s, in the 50s, right? But they were good enough for the Vietnam guys that got over. Remember.
What is to be said of Vietnam veterans today? Edward Carlsen would say not much, because they don't have a voice. They never had a voice. Sure, the awards and honors meant something to the men who earned them, but as retired Colonel Louis Millette would respond when asked, "What does the Medal of Honor mean to you?" He would say, "The medal is more indicative of the men that I led into battle than about me." Colonel Louis Millette shows great humility with this response. This represents not only the attributes of Louis Millette, but all men who faced the challenges of serving during the Vietnam War. The war was discouraging for many men, but they learned to serve their country even when their country hated them. Some of the awards, such as the Purple Heart, is even known to be called the award no one wants, earned through pain, suffering, and even death. The retired colonel was asked, "What is your opinion about the treatment that returning Vietnam War veterans received when they returned home to the United States?" Millette answered, "I thought it was horrible how badly Vietnam War soldiers were treated by their fellow Americans after returning back to the States. Just terrible. The American public wants you to go out and die for them, but they don't do anything for you when you return." The bottom line is the soldiers served this country and were disrespected when they returned to the people they were fighting for. Colonel Louis Millette states clearly that this is terrible. He describes the American public at this time as selfish because they wanted troops to leave the country and die, but did not want to thank them for their service when they survived. In these statements, Millette represents many veterans of the Vietnam War. However, it is unfortunate that most were never able to equally use their voice like Millette.
And that's why you've heard me say, when you say thank you for your service, if you know he's old enough to be at Vietnam, not me, all right? I'm a lieutenant colonel. I have my own airplane, right? I get babied, all right? Even in Vietnam, right? I mean, I wasn't walking around in rice paddies, right? Water, right? But a Vietnam veteran who was over there was slogging around, and I've counseled a number of guys, you know, just to bring it was severe what they did. All right. The interesting thing is they've lived with it all their life, and so when you say thank you for your service, welcome home, because no one ever did welcome them home. I was at Hobby Lobby, and there was a soldier, old guy like me, right? But he was telling the cashier about his time in Vietnam, and his wife was there, and he was telling about, and he had his old soldiers get their military back, and they get a hat that says Vietnam veteran or something like that. Right? And when he was done, I looked at him and I said, "Soldier, where did you serve?" And he said, "I was in the Delta, Dave Macon Delta." I said, "Thanks for your service and welcome home." And he started to cry. And the cashier was like, "Oh, geez," right? And his wife was consoling him, right? He said, "Sir, no one ever did." I said, "I know."
To all of our veterans, thank you for your service and welcome home.